Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the program Now You Know, Being Jewish During a Pandemic, What's Lost, What's Gained, presented by the UJA and the OJA, the Ontario Jewish Archives, Blankenstein Family Heritage Center. I'm Shoel Silver, the chair of the OJA, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our first webinar. Founded in 1973, the OJA is the largest repository of Jewish life in Canada. Our collections span all segments of Ontario's Jewish community, including families, businesses, cultural organizations, and synagogues. These records date from the community's earliest days in the province in the 1850s right up to the present. Each year, our team of archivists serves over 650 researchers and over 100 donors of archival material, providing access to the province's rich and vibrant Jewish history, told through thousands of photographs, documents, oral histories, historical newspapers, and much more, all part of the OJA's collection. Chances are we have something connected to your family's history. The OJA also organizes talks, exhibitions, programs, and walking tours to share the stories of our community's past. This spring has brought with it both change and uncertainty. As I'm sure many of you already know, UJA has responded to the uncertainty by launching its campaign early this year in order to give it the resources to respond immediately to the COVID-19 crisis. With the challenges that face our community as a collective and as individuals, every single dollar donated has the opportunity to save lives. If you're in a position to make a gift to UJA, no matter how big or small, you will play a crucial role in ensuring our community's future. To make a donation, please visit jewishtoronto.com. For the OJA, the last 10 weeks have been an introduction to working remotely. But our staff has enabled the OJA to continue to do what we do best, connect you to your history. New virtual learning opportunities, online programming, and podcasts are all part of our effort to bring many fascinating stories out of our vaults and into your homes. One of our podcasts takes you back 100 years to learn how our community dealt with the pandemic of that day, the Spanish flu. We hope you find today's webinar enlightening. Please visit the OJA's website, ontariojewisharchives.org, to learn more about our upcoming online programming. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram for daily archival photos and fun facts about our history and heritage. We also hope that what you discover inspires you to donate your family's records so we can preserve and share their story too. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of the Ontario Jewish Archives, Blankenstein Family Heritage Center, Dara Solomon.
Thank you, Shoel. Good afternoon, and thank you everybody for joining us. We are extremely grateful to those who help make these programs possible, including the OJA staff, our talented colleagues at UJA who help us facilitate these programs, as well as our generous donors and our sustaining partner, UJA Federation of Greater Toronto. Today, we are going to be exploring the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our Toronto Jewish community. And there's many different ways to explore this topic. At the Ontario Jewish Archives, we are interested in how the pandemic will be remembered and understood in the future. We're living through a formative period in our community's history. The global outbreak of COVID-19 and the response of countries and communities around the world will be the study of researchers for years to come. Just before Passover, the OJA launched a collection development initiative to collect documentation from individuals of the pandemic's impact on Jewish life and activities. Individuals have submitted a range of material. One family reflected on losing a beloved uncle to COVID just before the first Seder. Others submitted photos of themselves baking matzah for the first time, cross-continental Zoom Shabbats, an account from a nurse on the front lines, a musical performance of Eliyahu Hanavi performed by a father, his sons, and other neighboring musicians who played a song each night from the porch of their annex home. We hope you will submit your family's stories to this important documentation project. Another essential way for archives to document history is through oral histories or testimonies. Typically, these are taken years after an event. However, one of our guests today, Joshua Tapper, a historian, has developed a project to collect these testimonies in real time, and they will become part of the OJA's collection. Our conversation today will reflect on this project and open up a discussion on how this unprecedented period of social isolation that has disrupted much of Jewish communal life has also given rise to renewed connections to Jewish traditions and rituals in our home. We hope that you will join in on the conversation. And so please submit your questions through the chat function. And towards the end of this hour with you, we will respond to questions that have been submitted. Now for the introductions. Joshua Tapper is a doctoral candidate in Jewish history at Stanford University. His research focuses on the revival of Jewish organizational and cultural life in the late Soviet Union. He holds master's degrees in journalism from Columbia University and European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies from the University of Toronto. His journalism has appeared in the New York Times, the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail Tablet, and the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, among other publications. He lives in Toronto. We are also joined by Dr. Gillian Gold, Associate Professor in the Department of Folklore at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland. She's a historian whose work is shaped by memory and oral histories. Gold teaches a variety of undergraduate and graduate courses, including an intensive cultural documentation graduate field school that introduces students to the skills and techniques of ethnographic fieldwork, such as audio recording, interviewing, observational writing, and photography. Her research interests examine Jewish expressive culture, often through the lens of food. She has published journal articles and book chapters on topics ranging from the Toronto blueberry bun to the comfort meal, sometimes known as the hole in the middle, to a resident-led Sabbath tea at the terraces at Baycrest. Her current research explores the everyday and holiday customs of the non-Orthodox Jews. Thank you both for joining us today for this webinar. So we're going to start off with Josh explaining his project. Can you tell us the scope of your project, why you chose to do it, and where you are in its run so far?
Yes. First of all, thank you, Dara, and thanks to the OJA for inviting me to participate in this wonderful program. I'm glad to be here with Gillian to talk about the project, but also some of the issues that Toronto Jewry is facing as this crisis continues to unfold. So I initiated this project in mid-April, about a month or so after the province of Ontario declared a state of emergency, which was on March 17th. And this was, of course, followed by the closure of publicly funded schools on March 12th, and then recommendations to close private schools, libraries, recreation facilities, bars, restaurants, etc. A few days later, and the immediate impact on Jewish life in Toronto was I think obvious from the start. Synagogues were winding down in-person services and programming, and migrating stuff online. Schools were going virtual. Community organizations, nonprofits, and other institutions were, all of a sudden dealing with new kinds of need affecting people across all demographics. And so I wanted to somehow document the social structure and the cultural impact of the pandemic as it was reshaping the way that people live Jewish lives. I mean, hopefully it goes without saying that this crisis is a ground shifting event in our wider culture and in our individual communities and subcultures, and the Jewish community here in Toronto is Jewish communities all over the world are included in that, and so it will be incredibly important for researchers, community advocates, historians, policymakers, and so on, to have access to the experiences of people who lived through this crisis. So I developed this oral history project as a way to record and preserve not only personal experiences of the pandemic, but changes, adaptations, innovations, challenges that Jewish institutions in the city are facing as the pandemic unfolds. And so, I mean, the idea is, as much as possible to capture a panoramic view of Jewish life in Toronto during the COVID-19 period. And so I'm interviewing rabbis and lay leaders, the heads of nonprofits and charitable and philanthropic organizations, people in the healthcare and elder care sectors, people in the funeral and burial industry, and so on. So I'll say then that the research is very much, it's very much a portrayal of Jewish official and institutional culture in the city, but at the same time, I think it's meant to address a series of questions that Jewish communities across the continent and around the world are dealing with, like how do you serve a Jewish community in this new reality under these new conditions? How did Jews experience institutional Jewish life as it's being recast and reconceptualized in real time? So I've done about a dozen interviews so far, and I'm aiming for around 50. Although I'm, by design, not putting any constraints on the number of people that I'll talk to. The ultimate goal is to return to these interviews a year or so down the road, and so then get another set of reflections. Another one of the goals of the project is to capture narratives and memories of the pandemic experience before broader collective narratives, interpretations, and memories take root. So it'll be interesting and hopefully illuminating as well to see sort of down the road how people I'm talking to have processed what's been taking place over these months.
And Jillian, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and how a collection like this you could imagine referencing using in the future, and how your work in the past has used similar kinds of material.
So, well, thank you, and it's great to be here with you and to learn more about Josh's work. So I would start just by saying, as a folklorist, I'm interested in everyday life and customs. It's often the things we do without thinking twice about, but that are rooted to our identities and add meaning to our lives. At the heart of folklore research is identifying and documenting traditional expressive culture. So the everyday customs that are not official or institutional and change from community to community, family to family, and individual to individual. So Josh's work adds a different dimension to it, starting with that sort of official histories, but also the people of the institutions and of the official cultures. Thinking about expressive culture for Jews, it could be anything from davening in shul to preparing chicken soup for Friday night or Shabbat dinner, eating bagel lox for Sunday brunch. And many families partake in these traditions, which are not officially Jewish, and they also have variations, their own way of doing things. So by identifying and documenting these customs, we highlight the intersection of creativity and everyday life. So the work, it works together really well, the work of folklorists and the work of oral historians. Like oral historians, folklorists rely on the oral recorded interview, audio recorded interview, but in addition, we conduct ethnographic field work. So writing observational notes, using photography, and getting a sense of traditional expressive culture in context. So, so my general sense is that an oral historian might be interested, let's say, in somebody's cookbook collection and might interview a person about the collection, but a folklorist might also spend time with the person in the kitchen, documenting what and how the person cooks and what variations or flourishes they make to the official recipes. So, so they work. Josh's work is fantastic because he's looking at sort of this bigger historical picture and starting with the institutional and the official figures, and then it would really inform how a folklorist might then approach it. Going from the rabbis to how are people from the congregations, working through this. So,
right. Josh, I wonder if you can talk broadly about some of your observations from the interviews that you've done. Like, what have been some of the common threads or the challenges, the opportunities that are facing the Jewish community?
Right. Well, I should just say at the outset that that my research at this point is it's preliminary. So these are
Right.
so these are early observations. But I can share some things that are starting to come together. I think the overarching thread, it seems to me, is actually sort of right in the title of this webinar: what's lost, what's gained. What's lost, what's gained. That's the title of the webinar. And there's this this profound duality of experience in what's being lost and what's being gained in this moment. On a material level, what's being lost is a little easier to identify. Canceled programs and life cycle events, the inability to socialize in places that for a lot of people are major social hubs, the inability to worship in places that are built into our spiritual and cultural DNA as members of the Jewish community. But on a broader cultural level, the loss, I think, is a little harder to perceive or make sense of, especially right now in this moment. It's not only about the adaptations that institutions are making as a form of reaction that might seem lesser or inadequate to what we're used to. It's this concern that fundamentally things won't be as they were, and so to be able to generate meaning out of these experiences is an incredible challenge for the people and institutions I've spoken with. That being said, these challenges are being embraced, and they already have. The people I've spoken with have found, they found new opportunities for emotional and spiritual engagement, and outreach to people in their orbits who weren't normally active participants, whether it's attending a minyan or taking part in tzedakah or tikkun olam projects, whatever. So I'm starting to see, some institutions, maybe synagogues, most of all, kind of reasserting themselves as centers or nodal points for Jewish experience. Another major theme has to do with the definition and parameters of community. Participating in Jewish life demands a certain degree of intimacy with other Jews, whether it's family members in the home, members of a congregation or a community center, or school, a study circle, summer camps, overseas trips. The list goes on, and the nature of that has changed fundamentally. And so leaders are tasked now with thinking about how these various communal intimacies are going to be preserved. Like, how do you maintain meaningful tefillah or prayer over Zoom? How do you foster a meaningful Jewish educational environment when kids aren't together in school? And finally, I'd add that I think it's become, for better or worse, it's become a truism of the pandemic that that this crisis kind of brings out, the warts, for lack of a better word, in all areas of society and culture. And so within the Jewish community here, here in Toronto and elsewhere, issues that have been a concern for some institutions for a long time are really crystallizing or coming to the surface. These are things like the viability of the synagogue membership dues model, which is a concern now if people are less likely to use a brick and mortar space for their religious experience. That's one example. Maybe we can talk more in the Q&A, but institutions will have to become more flexible, more receptive to technology than they already have, not just as a crutch, but as a major sort of tool for engagement and continuity. And the people I'm talking to have recognized that very early on.
Mm-hmm. And Jillian, as a folklorist, when you were relying on oral histories and testimonies that document Jewish cultural and religious life, I'm wondering, like, how you think about those adaptations that Josh mentioned that he's seeing in in Jewish communal life, like in synagogues, adapting? Like, how do you see that playing out in the work that you do?
Well, I think it's all about being flexible or adaptable. I mean, there's on the one end of the scale, there's no flexibility, but the most observant, the most orthodox who are following rules. But even so, using a crock pot on Shabbat or the baker's oven, there are ways to be flexible or adapt, to adapt. I was even thinking of, a time when women weren't included in a minyan, and they are, in some congregations now. So I started to think about, what would a Zoom minyan be? How long would this last? Would 10 people on Zoom count as a minyan? I don't know, but there are ways that we are thinking about, ways to be flexible. Are you eating, inside or outside? My dad had this great story when he was a teenager, and a friend of his who kept kosher, they had ordered pizza, and it was a novelty then. And he said, he put the pizza on the roof of his car. He wouldn't take it in the car. He said, this is a kosher car. So these different ways, I mean, it's very individual and very quirky, but there are ways that as individuals, people are are connected, following rules, feeling connected to Judaism. There is a connectivity. There are these threads, but they have to be flexible or adaptable, or they choose to be flexible and adaptable. And I think with Zoom, especially, coming into, well, we can talk about it more, I don't know, after, but, Zoom seders and Zoom bar mitzvahs, and, even what does it mean to use the internet on Shabbos? So these are things that, in this time that people need to feel connected. And I love this initiative of the OJA collecting the Zoom Seder, the photos of the Zoom Seder tables. It's just, wonderful. So I think that is something where we're always thinking about, how are we adapting and becoming flexible, and just thinking about things differently in this very unusual time.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken about there seems to be like an increased amount of Jewish participation in the home life. Families baking matzah for the first time, people getting really into the bread baking, the challah making. And can you comment on that? I think you called it domestic Judaism, and this period is actually seems really positive for that kind of Jewish engagement.
Yeah, right. It's fascinating. So, I'll address this in home baking as well as Passover, that there has been this turn to Jewish domestic culture. And I think throughout the pandemic, to, domestic culture in general, I think that's one of the silver linings of this, of the pandemic, not for everyone, but for those who are, home and working from home and who are healthy. We've been given this gift of time, or at least more time at home. And I think, we're hearing a lot about people trying their hand at challah baking, sharing pictures on social media, taking online workshops, talking about food, taking out old cookbooks. So I've even been baking through my mom's Lillian Kaplan, for the love of baking. And so I'm sure that, I imagine, people who are here are familiar with that book. And so yes, families, synagogues, Havurah groups are hosting Zoom Shabbat services, and then Passover, just to say a few words, was so compelling. We all wondered what would a Seder look like, and collecting these photographs is fantastic. Whoever could have imagined this? And I think Jewish domestic culture is so private, but as when we're doing things at home, it's reassuring that the actions that take place in our homes, Shabbat tables, Seder meals, braided challah, there's always been a sense of connectivity that that Jews are setting their tables in similar ways and eating similar foods. But with this pandemic, it's no longer private or in the imagination. So we're opening up windows into our homes, participating in challah baking workshops or rugula or falafel, making Jewish food with others, and showing our kitchens and our inclinations to partake in traditional Jewish food ways. We're preparing and eating and sharing. So I think that this idea of sharing traditional culture through screen seemed so hard to imagine previously, and now it's become something that we do. So this door, this window has opened, and it's, I see it as, you know, a confirmation or a connection that goes beyond our private homes and families into something that is bigger.
That's great. Josh, I know that you've spoken to several rabbis, and we learned from one of our OJA board members that the Junction Shul, one of Toronto's oldest synagogues, hasn't had weekly Shabbat services since the 1960s, but they've been running Shabbat services now on Zoom, and they're getting dozens of people to show up. So I'm curious to hear from you, both like on the more conservative reform as well as the Orthodox side. How are rabbis responding to this, to what's happening?
Right. So I haven't spoken to anyone at the Junction Shul yet, but their experience is definitely it's definitely something shared by some of the other synagogues I've spoken to. If we're thinking about what's been gained, the pandemic in some ways has, you know, it's created this this marketplace for Jewish religious experience. You can log onto a Zoom Shabbat, a Zoom Kabbalat Shabbat with the Junction Shul, but you can also log into a Zoom Shabbat with a shul somewhere else in the world. You know, so the possibilities for davening have increased exponentially, especially for those whose Shabbat and ritual observance enables them to maybe try out Shabbat services in different time zones or something. And, you know, so as for rabbis, the conversations, I mean, have been fascinating. I believe every synagogue I've spoken to launched a large-scale outreach campaign in mid-March, calling congregants, first those of a certain age, or who live alone, or who require some form of assistance, but then everyone else, which is a massive undertaking. And I think one of the things that's come out of this for some rabbis is, you know, sort of the power and the meaningfulness of taking the shul, you know, sort of beyond its own doors, in this case into people's homes. Now, calling people at home is not something necessarily out of the ordinary for synagogues, but as you know, as Jillian was discussing, sort of bringing programming and bringing services into people's homes, you know, is not something that was often done for synagogues. So, you know, one of the things that I'm starting to think about in doing these interviews is along the same lines as Jillian, you know, what this might mean for how we practice Judaism at home. Right, historically, we you know, we can think of, or we can speak of an institutional Jewish life and a domestic Jewish life, and these have always been blurred in some ways. But you know, as rabbis and synagogues start to think about future planning, I think these barriers are becoming a little fuzzier. And so. Other stuff from rabbis that I've gathered, you know, in different denominations, of course, have had to wade through, you know, halachic decision making over how to do minyanim, Shabbat, the mourner's Kaddish, and so on. So that's been a big part of their job, but sort of. More than that, one thing I'm hearing is that rabbis, perhaps more than ever in their own experience as rabbis, are sort of, you know, taking on the role of translator, which is something that rabbis have always done, of course, you know, translating Jewish ritual and prayer for those who might not be fluent in it, and, you know, I mean, historically advising people on how to navigate secular culture and society and Jews, but, you know, but this is an especially acute example, at least in my living memory, you know, about how rabbis are conveying how our lives can be lived Jewishly when, you know, when the ground has shifted. So, you know, for rabbis themselves, by and large, they'll say that their jobs haven't changed so much. But I can share a couple stories that I think speak to the emotional experience that rabbis are going through. And I should say that some of the interviews that I've had with rabbis have been quite emotional. These are people who are they interface with hundreds, or they have interfaced with hundreds of people over the past several weeks, and it's incredible work, incredible taxing work. One rabbi told me that he had never sort of quite understood how his facial cues and expressions were in connecting with his congregants, and so while he recognized that of course his words and messages are vital, much of the charisma that's sort of required by a rabbi is expressed through his face or her face, and people's ability to see that face and connect with it. And so he told me about a funeral service he led during the pandemic, and everyone there was wearing a mask. And after the funeral ended and people left the graveside and were walking to their cars, a man sort of called out to this rabbi to stop. And so he stopped, and the two of them sort of stood a safe distance apart. And the man, from across the way, asked the rabbi to take off his mask. He wanted to see the rabbi's face, and so the rabbi took off his mask, and the two men just stood there silently, looking at each other for a couple of minutes, not saying a word, and they put their masks back on and they continued on to their cars. Like I said, rabbis are saying that their roles haven't changed necessarily; they've only kind of intensified. But they're aware. They're aware what they have to do to embrace this new intensity, I think. Another story I can share is about an online bar mitzvah where this particular synagogue actually brought the Sefer Torah, the Torah scroll, to the bar mitzvah family's home. So the Torah reading could be live streamed, which is an amazing feat in and of itself. And so the bar mitzvah experience wasn't the same, of course, but the things that mattered, that family was present, that a tradition was maintained, that a ritual happened, these things were all still in place. And so during all life cycle events now, the rabbi at this synagogue is quick to identify the strangeness of the moment that everyone is in and that everyone is sharing, this intensity of the moment, but then offers assurances that the things that matter don't have to be compromised.
I'm curious about the Orthodox community, given that the limitations with technology, and I imagine that there's more isolation and a greater perhaps sense of loss of Jewish communal life. Can you comment at all about from any of the interviews that you've had?
Yeah, it's actually it's actually been sort of the opposite, and by and large things are sort of operating or unfolding similarly as they are with other denominations. I mean, the same issues around what's lost in terms of social experience when a synagogue community can't gather over Shabbat or Yom Tov is applies to an Orthodox synagogue as they do to Reform, right? I mean, Orthodox synagogues and leaders have been using technology in the same way that other denominations have for Kabbalat Shabbat and Havdalah and other life cycle events like Brit Milah, Shivas, weddings, and so on. I should say that conservative synagogues as well are grappling with these questions as well. So it's not only in the Orthodox world, but there's also there's this principle of Jewish law called Pikuach Nefesh, right, which is about prioritizing the preservation of human life and safety over following Jewish law. One Orthodox rabbi told me that very early on, he invoked Pikuach Nefesh for his congregation, which allowed people who were in need to call him on Shabbat. no one has, but it's in,
Right.
but it's there. And so, I mean, like within the Orthodox world, halakha can have some variability, right? There's what you strive for and what you can actually manage and practice. And so the Orthodox leaders I've spoken to, like everyone else, are responding to this moment.
Right. To switch gears a little bit, obviously the pandemic has caused, incredible hardship for many people. And though we've been lucky in Ontario to have had, fewer cases, relatively speaking to some other places, the financial fallout is really staggering, and people are suffering from job loss and challenging domestic situations. I'm curious from the organizations you spoke to, how they feel like the increased pressure on them to respond to this crisis and to helping people in a way they maybe never imagined that they would have to be helping.
Well, so I mean, of the institutions I've spoken to, they haven't really been struggling with donations and fundraising. Although they're very aware that if the economy continues to slide as it looks like it will, unfortunately, that challenge might present itself in the future, especially if smaller donations dry up, or people who took on volunteering or grassroots leadership positions are themselves in an unstable position and need to commit themselves elsewhere. Synagogues are in an interesting position now in that they've already sort of maybe already hit their revenue targets for the year because we're after the high holidays, and so now have a bit of time to figure things out until the fall. Although of course this is part of thinking about the future of these institutions is maybe reassessing different funding models. I would say as well that that some of the larger philanthropic organizations in the city, like B'nai B'rith, and Federation as well, are kind of set up for crisis mobilization, and they have these systems in place, like food banks, visitations with seniors, clothing donations, and so on. And they were able to kind of ratchet things up when needed.
Right. I'm curious about sort of the long view with this situation. Like, as historians, how do you think this period will be examined? I mean, there's so many different directions you could go in, but Jillian, maybe you could comment on what you think as a historian this long-term impact might be on the community, and how we'll be looking at it 20, 30, 40 years from now.
Right. So, and I, as a folklorist, I mean, this is a great question, and we can only be speculative here, right?
Right.
So, what would it be? Will we remember to be kind? Will we become accustomed to joining in for services? Will we continue to spend more time with our families? I'm just from my own experiences, what I'm seeing. Experiencing more family time. Kids are, talking more to grandparents. So I'm seeing in this home way that how it's bringing families together. So, and these connections, I do think that the more we do things, the more accustomed we become. But I wonder, here we are, I've made, Shabbat something important in our home now, because it's something that makes the day different from every other day that has just blended into each other. And I think, I wonder, we did it before, but some days maybe it was rushed, or some days we would do takeout. But I do wonder I don't know. Again, it's we can only guess, but let's hope that the good stuff stays.
Right. Josh,
right.
What about you? What do you think?
Right. Yeah. Historians don't like to make projections.
Right.
It's anathema to what they do. But I mean, speaking through people I've interviewed, we don't know, right? Just like Jillian said, there will be very real consequences on revenue streams, on people's appetite for in-person experience. In that sense, things might go back to the way they were because people recognize how important and powerful those in-person experiences are. But of those I've talked to, and these are leaders, not congregants, or quote unquote ordinary people, but there's not a whole lot of confidence that people will come back, at least in the near term. But crisis breeds opportunity, right? And so what I'm hearing is that no matter what, on an institutional level, changes are being implemented now, or they're gestating, especially regarding technology. These changes probably won't go away. The rhythm of synagogue life is going to have to account for people who want to be a part of a congregation but don't necessarily want to worship or attend programs in a building, and then from that, how group prayer, say, can be made meaningful online, where it's difficult to sing together. So, people are thinking, positively now. In the city, there's been, and I glean this talking from people in the nonprofit world, that there's been an outpouring of volunteerism and engagement, including among young people. So long-term impact could mean. It could mean a higher level of engagement in Jewish institutional life. I think a lot of leaders are thinking along those lines. And so, while speaking generally, culture is kind of atomizing and becoming more diffuse, people are engaging in their identities in a multitude of ways. There's an opening here for Jewish institutions, to hold on to these newly engaged or use these technologies to reach out to people they might not have had access to before. And then actually, and this just came up in speaking to someone earlier today about a possible long-term impact of the pandemic, is that I've heard from several people that there are sort of new partnerships and collaborations being built, like especially within the synagogue world. Even among synagogues that kind of work together within the context of the Rabbinical Assembly or the Vad HaRabbanim in Toronto, that that are kind of just on paper working together. But now people are reaching out to colleagues and establishing. These new solidarity networks, so there's a sense that if that can hold on, it's a positive thing.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that this opportunity to collaborate with organizations in a very meaningful, responsive way has been transformational, and I hope that some of that spirit continues on into the future. I'm curious about something you had said earlier when we talked about restoration versus renovation for synagogues, and I think for other Jewish institutions too. Like, do you just throw everything away and start from scratch, or what do you do in a situation like this when everything has been so disrupted?
Right. This is another theme emerging in the interviews. Again, I have a relatively small sample size, but what I'm hearing is that renovation, will really be the order of the day. I think leaders. I'm going to mix metaphors here. I think the leaders I've spoken with, they understand that the crisis is not something to really weather and try to emerge from as unscathed as possible, so that whatever's left after the hurricane blows through can be sort of re-inhabited. But again, they see this crisis as an opportunity to build on top of these foundations that were already in place. And I say that with no building experience, but I think it makes I think it makes sense. So what I'm hearing is this incredible will to make changes in funding models, the kinds of programs that are offered, programs that are more inclusive the ways that seniors are engaged with inside and outside the synagogue, that only comes out of this crisis mode that institutions are now in, and from that, the need for a leadership to actually sort of work quickly when something as significant as well as continuity might be at stake.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Jillian, do you have any thoughts on? Josh touched on like the impact on young adults and people volunteering and stepping up because they realize although they are having a tough situation, it's not as difficult as some other people, and sort of the impact on individuals to engage more deeply in tikkun olam and to be part of the community in a way that they hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, and I can't. I haven't looked into this, but I'm imagining that would be the case. I can't really speak to that about what people are doing, but yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to take some questions that have been submitted, and for the participants, please feel free to continue on. So I guess this is sort of like the biggest question in terms of shuls that a lot of people have on their minds, which is high holiday services. And where does it seem like we're going from the rabbis and the community leaders that you spoke to about that?
Right. So it's going somewhere, but no one knows where that is. I think to some extent it will be determined by the province and how these reopening stages unfold. Like I know in the Orthodox community now, there's a plan in place that once gatherings of 25 people are allowed to happen, that backyard minyanim will be able to take place, and so people from a particular congregation might sort of join into like a smaller congregation in someone's backyard, so sort of do services with or pray or daven within the context of that community, only in a smaller iteration. But for high holidays, there are some very, very big synagogues in Toronto, and they know that like no matter what, it would be a huge logistical challenge. Trying to pull one off, and so I mean the short answer is it's too early to say, but. I mean, no one wants to have a Zoom Rosh Hashanah or a Zoom Yom Kippur. No one wanted to have a Zoom Pesach. But again, they'll sort of have to follow government regulations and make the best of it.
Okay. Jillian, this is a question for you. Somebody wondered how you document oral Jewish life from Newfoundland, and so I guess I'm curious they're curious to know a little more about your work, and given where you are, where there isn't an extensive Jewish community in St. John.
Right. So I haven't done a lot with the Jewish community here. There are several small communities. There's a Havara group, and there's a Chabad. Chabad here. So it's here, but it's very small. So I do not document it. Although I did give a conference paper on the Havara. Well, one of the things I'll say is that it's and there's a synagogue, I should say. My goodness, there's a synagogue and a Havara and a Chabad, so it's legit. Three groups that don't talk to each other, or they do. So, but I was. What's very interesting is the Havara group has services every other week in people's homes, and then has a shared meal. I mean, obviously, this hasn't been happening since COVID. But they would have a vegetarian meal. Not that it necessarily means that it's kosher, but it allowed for, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, so anyway, I was interested in brisket and, you know, missing the brisket, and I did write a paper on that, on the meals and what it means to be a vegetarian Jewish group and what it means to not make brisket, you know, for some of the big holidays. So I've done small projects, but most of the work I've done and that I'm looking to do actually will take place in Toronto, where I grew up and have other kinds of connections as well. So yeah, it is a very small group here.
And I guess the vegetarian Shabbat is one of those adaptations that we were discussing earlier that we as Jews have managed to adapt over time in order to continue and to say, you know.
Yeah, and then one day you say, I really miss the brisket.
Right.
But no, I think, yeah, it is definitely an adaptation and a way to keep the community as open as possible.
Yes. So somebody asked if there's any previous periods in Jewish history that have called for improvisation, adaptation, and survival. And I would say that we are a history of these kinds of crises that have, you know, necessitated adaptation. Do you want to talk about any like commonalities that you know of between what's happened now and with things that have gone on in our past? I mean, this is so different than anything, but if you could think about it in that way.
Right. Well, I you know, as you pointed out, I mean, you know, Jewish history is a history of these adaptations, right? You know, not only in response to crisis or you know, war or whatever, but to modernity and other cultural shifts. You know, as Jews settled in different parts of the globe. So in that sense, there's nothing unique about this. I was in one of my interviews, someone mentioned how the conversations that he's having with Holocaust survivors about this moment is very different than the conversations he's having with younger generations, and the Holocaust survivors are saying, this is nothing.
Right.
You know.
Yes, I've been hearing a lot of that. Yeah.
Right. That it's not nothing, but they have, but there's this belief that, you know, Jewish life and Jewish experience is going to continue, right? It's not going to be eradicated, as you know, as we've been discussing. It'll only adapt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So somebody asked about like creating new rituals. So not necessarily just putting our rituals on Zoom or online, but have you heard anything about new rituals being convened that sort of respond to this moment of social distancing and social isolation? Any shuls or people in people's homes that they might be doing? I mean, one thing I sort of thought about is like these, like, we've had a lot of like driveway get-togethers with like family members that my parents come to see the kids and they stand from a distance, and there's some, and we do this with neighbors as well. Yeah. You know, these, so it's interesting. This like new way of socializing. Yeah. Right.
I mean, yeah. In all of these life cycle events, there are any number of I hesitate to call them innovations, but I don't know, abnormalities or something like that.
Right.
You know, that when a bris is taking place, where is the camera positioned? Right. Or you know, for, you know, again, for a funeral, where is the camera positioned, or for a shiva, you know, how is Zoom set up, and how do people, you know, how do rabbis who play a strong pastoral role in these moments, how do they be a part of this in a meaningful way? And so some have done what they would have done at the event itself, maybe before, or they'll wait until after, or they'll kind of just sort of set things up and then hand it over to the people who are celebrating the simcha or whatever. So in some ways it's kind of giving people some autonomy in ritual practice, and the carrying out of life cycle events that they might not have considered possible beforehand.
It's interesting. Jillian, did you have anything to add?
Just to say that it's so interesting that we've had these technologies for a long while, and it's just now that we're using them in this way. I've heard of, there have been funerals that have been, online, but this is really different. And I think that there's a real shift that's taken place. And so how we're leaning to technology in a way that, who would ever think, Josh, that story with the rabbi in the face is so moving. And, when you just think, you can be in person, and if your face is covered, who would ever think that having an interaction online could in some way be more meaningful, that something could be shared in that way. So it's figuring that part out. How are people connecting? How are people, even someone saying, oh, I've always wanted to, I always wanted to learn how you make, honey cake or mandelbrot or whatever it is. And, people are doing it now. And this is just, again, personal, but a friend, who's teaching her niece now, one of her, so it's just things that people are doing. And it's just, there's such a shift, and it's using technology that we always had, but it's become so much more important. And it's so strange because, we want to think that this is not meaningful. But in this very strange time, it's become meaningful. So.
Great. So we're just about out of time. So I want to thank you both. You've given us all a lot to reflect on and to think about for who knows how long we're going to be in this. So I want to thank you both for your time, and thank everybody for joining us today for this webinar. For those listening in, I hope you will consider donating your stories to the Ontario Jewish Archives, either material related to the pandemic or just to your family's stories. And you can do that by contacting us at ojainquiries@ujafed.org. And please join us again for our next free webinar about the history of the Standard Theater. It's called Art Out of the Archives, From Yiddish Theater to Kung Fu Films to Contemporary Art. And it's on Tuesday, June 2nd at 4 p.m. And you can visit our website for more information about our other programs and about donating your records to the Ontario Jewish Archives. So thank you again for joining us today. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.